Hello everybody, my name is Keith Lewis and I'm here today on behalf of the Music Weeklies Community to talk to you a little bit about mixing. This is part one of what's going to be a three-part series that takes you from the very beginning of a mix once your composition has been completed, all the way to something you can send off to a client or put onto an album. So today we're just going to cover mix setup and doing a rough mix that we can refine in parts 2 and 3. A little bit of preamble before we get started. I am going to be working in Reaper today. It's the DAW that I'm most familiar with. It's absolutely not necessary to get Reaper or to work in Reaper to use any of these techniques in your own mixes. It's just the DAW that I'm most familiar with, and there should be all of the component parts that you're familiar with in your own workstation. All the instruments I'm using in this composition are either from Native Instruments Complete, or I recorded a live guitar myself, and I'm simulating the amps with Guitar Rig from Native Instruments as well. All the plugins I'm going to be using are either stock Reaper, or I believe there are 2 reverbs that I'm using in this project that I got for free. So everything should be very accessible. I'm not using any advanced technology here. It's all just my ears and a little bit of knowledge that I've gained over years of mixing. So step 1 is of course going to be just listening through the piece. So this is the track order is all as I composed it, so each part that you see, that's the part that was added in order. There's no mix done at all. It's just totally even. I've brought it down far enough that it won't peak as we listen to it. So let's go ahead and listen through the piece. Okay, so that's the mix we're working with. As you can hear, it's not very good. Now, when I'm listening through a piece, at any point in the mixing process, I'm listening for 3 key things. I'm listening for breadth, depth, and clarity. And what I mean when I say that is, for breadth, I want to hear the stereo image. There needs to be stuff on the left, stuff on the right, not too heavy in either direction. but a nice spread so that I can kind of pick out the location left to right of everything that I'm listening to. For depth, there should be a forward and back feeling. I should be able to hear instruments that are in front of other instruments. Obviously stuff that is lead, I want pretty much directly in front of me. I don't want everything right here in front of my face. There should also be stuff that's behind that supporting it. And when I talk about clarity, I should also be able to listen through the mix. I should be able to hear any instrument I want at any point in this mix. Now, obviously, we're just starting out. This has none of those things. Pretty much all the panning is dead center. There's not a lot of depth to it. Things are kind of at wonky distances, so I'm going to try to fix a little bit of that here for my rough mix. So the first thing I want to do is just organize my project so it makes sense to me. And the way that I typically do this is I start with my more contemporary instruments, drum sets, keyboards, guitars, things like that up top, and then the more traditional orchestral instruments down below. Now the contemporary instruments I mix from the bottom up foundationally, which means I'm going to start with my drums, and I'm going to break those up, and you'll see that in just a second here. Then come my bass instruments, then my keyboard instruments, and then my guitars usually go last in that order because those are the things I want to mix last. That order kind of evolved over several years, both, I mean, that's how I was taught to mix. That's how most people, most mix engineers order their mixes. But it's absolutely not necessary to do it in that order. I cannot stress that enough. There is no right way to do things. Whatever works for you, lay things out in a way that makes sense to you. So let's just take a second, and I'm going to put these tracks in order that kind of makes sense to me for the contemporary instruments. So I'm starting with my drums, which are here. I bring those up to the top. Those are the first things I'm going to want to deal with in my mix. Next comes my bass instruments. Now, I've got double bass here, which is kind of functioning as a bass instrument in the contemporary sense of it, but I'm going to stick that down in the classical section because it's also a string instrument, and it makes more sense to me down there. So I'm going to go, where'd my strings go? There are my strings. Pop the double bass by my strings. My bass is covered by this guy, which is a synth in Native Instruments Massive. So there's one bass instrument, and then I also create this guy, which is actually, I call it the Apocalypse Piano. It's a piano run through a bunch of stuff in guitar rig to make it sound really scary and huge, which is also kind of functioning as a bass in this piece. From there, I want to get my keyboard instruments in there, which is, I think, just my soft electric piano. I think everything else is either a classical instrument or a guitar. Yep, okay. So there's my bass instruments, my keyboard instrument, and now I'm going to grab all my guitar tracks, all million guitar tracks that I have recorded here, and bring those up as well. And then we get into the classical instruments. Now, with classical stuff, I tend to mix in what's considered score order, so how you would look at it as an orchestral score. Growing up as a classical musician, that's how I'm just used to seeing things. Again, don't feel like you need to follow this order. You can do it on your own. Score order would traditionally be from the top down. So starting with your strings, violin, viola, cello, double bass, going into your woodwinds, starting with your flutes, going through your bass clarinets, your contrabass clarinets, bass saxophone, whatever weird reeds you're using, and then ending with the brass, going into melodic percussion, and then percussion. I'm going to switch that order up a little bit in this case just because of how the instruments are functioning and how I think about them in the mix. So we've got our strings are going to be up top. Excuse me, our harp's going to be first because that's kind of functioning as a keyboard instrument here, which typically would also be at the top or the bottom of the order, just in terms of where I'm using it here because it's the first thing that we hear. I'm going to leave it at the top. Strings go after that. Double bass, which is, again, functioning as a little bit as a string here, is going to sit below those. My celesta is more of a lead instrument, so I'm going to put that down towards the bottom that carries the melody. And I'm going to keep that with my reversed celesta. And then my staccato strings are going to go up here below my double bass because strings go together. All right, so we've got a vague order here now about basically the priority in which I want to be mixing things. So the next step in my process is I'm going to be taking my grouped instrument channels, primarily the drums and the strings, and I'm going to break them up each into their component elements and put them into what are called buses. If you've hung out with audio people for any length of time, you've probably heard them refer to buses. All that is a channel through which you feed other channels so that they can they give you greater control over those groups of instruments. So for instance, my drums channel here is combining a whole bunch of different instruments. It's got the kick drum, the snare drum, the hi-hat, the toms, all the cymbals, And that's all controlled with one set of parameters, which I don't like. I want more control than that. So what I'm going to actually do is create another channel here, which is my drum bus. I'm going to name it thusly. And then I'm going to take my drums, and I'm actually going to break it up into each of those component instruments. So it'll be kick, snare, hi-hat. I'm going to combine all my toms into one channel. I don't need that much control right now. You certainly can break up your toms if you want to. And then I'm going to go from my toms to the overhead microphones, which is basically all of the cymbals that would be hanging over the top of the drum kit. And I'm just going to do that by duplicating my drum track. Kick, snare, what did I say? Kick, snare, hat, toms, overheads. 5 channels. I'm going to leave a 6th just so I have a master in case I accidentally delete anything. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Oops, that's one too many. So, drums channel gets muted. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take all of these drum tracks. I'm just going to pop them as a subfolder of the drum bus. Now, this may be confusing to some people who don't deal with Reaper, because not every DAW has that function. You can link the tracks, but the biggest thing is create a drum bus, and you can create sends that go through that bus, and it achieves the same effect. So I'm going to rename each of these by the instrument that I want them to represent. Kick, snare, hats, toms, and overheads. All right, so I've broken up my group instrument tracks, the drums and the strings, into their component parts. It's worth noting that when I did the string tracks, I just broke them up by voice and then actually replaced the general strings patch that I used to play the part in with the actual like violin patch for the violins, the viola patch for the viola, and the cello patch for the cellos, etc. I also actually left the strings general patch active and audible just because I think it adds some nice color to it, adds some richness to that sound. So now that we've got things broken up and more or less in an order that we are going to be able to work easily with, let's start the actual mix process. So what I'm going to do is actually mute every single channel that I have from the beginning to the end and slowly unmute them one by one just to get a feel for where I want them to be. So make sure that you don't accidentally unmute all of them at the same time. We're just going to start with the kick drum and put it at a level that we think is appropriate. So we're going to jump here to where the kick comes in and just give it a listen. Okay, that feels like a good place for the kick. Let's add the snare to that. Everything is relative here. Alright, about 5 dB over 0 with that snare fader, which I don't love. I'm going to bring that back a little bit, because you can see what's happening right now is it's starting to clip as the snare gets a little hotter. Alright, let's add the hi-hat into this. Now with drums, there's 2 approaches to how you want to pan them. There's either drummer's perspective, in which case you're panning, as though you're sitting at the drum set drumming, or you can mix audience perspective, which is the reverse of that, as though you are looking at the drum set. For a long time, I always mixed audio perspective because the mixes that I was doing were designed to make it feel like you were in the room with the musicians. But it was pointed out to me recently, and this is a very good point that totally changed my mind. I now mix drummer's perspective because when someone's listening to a track with really good drums, they want to air drum along. And if you put the hi-hat on the wrong side, it feels really weird. So I now mix drummer's perspective, which means the hi-hat is going to go to the listener's left. And I'm going to put that pretty extremely far over to about 80%, and we're just going to listen to that and see how it feels. It's a little bit far. Let's bring it back. 65 feels about good with where a hi-hat would be if I was sitting at a drum kit. Okay, let's bring the toms in. Now, because the toms are all in one channel, they're actually panned within the plugin, so I'm not going to mess with those. They're in the right place already. Now, already I'm thinking about clarity. I want to hear the kick drum and that low tom as separate drums. It's really easy for those to blend together in the mix, so I want to make sure I'm keeping those at a level where I can hear both of them independently very easily. And now let's add the overheads in. That's hot. And again, just like the toms, the overheads are actually panned within the plugin, within the drum instrument. So I don't need to worry about placement of each and every one of those cymbals. But you can certainly do that if you want to pick out each cymbal individually. And again, just put them all individually into the drum bus and pan them the way that you want them to be. So let's listen to the whole thing together. And let's go to a place where we have a little more overhead action. Okay, I can hear everything there pretty well. I'm probably going to just bring the overheads down a skosh from there. And now let's add the next foundational element in, the bass. So here's my bass synthesizer. Now I definitely want my bass to be present in this mix. It's going to be driving a lot of the feel, and this is where a lot of the thickness from the tone comes from for the overall mix. Because there's not many low instruments in here. And bass generally is going to be panned dead center. You want that to be a very central role, and I'm not just saying that because I am a bass player. It really is a central element for the sound in a lot of mixes. Okay, that's sounding pretty good to me so far. I'm just keeping an eye on my master channel here to make sure that I'm not getting close to clipping. I'm a little close with -2, -2.5, but that's actually plenty of headroom as I'm mixing. Okay, so I'm going to keep moving down the mix here. You can see the Apocalypse piano actually stops playing here, so I'm not going to worry about that yet. I'm not questioning the placement of it, but here we're at sort of the mushing point between the classical instruments and the more contemporary ones. The harp's going to be really hard because it is just naturally a soft instrument, and I want it to be both gentle at the beginning and audible here at the end. Now, it doesn't mean it has to be screaming through the front of the mix, but I definitely want it to be present. Again, that's part of that clarity. And part of what will help it part of what will help make it clear is I'm actually going to pan it just a skosh to the left. Left versus right is just kind of arbitrarily chosen. But I'm just going to put it a little bit to the left so that I can pick it out of the mix a little bit easier, because there's a lot of stuff that's dead center so far. We have the kick, the snare, and the bass are all dead center and occupying kind of the same frequency range. So I'm going to just bump the harp a little off to the side, about 10% to the left. Nothing too drastic, just a little bit, if I can get my mouse to cooperate. And that helps it stand out just a little bit. Now let's add this electric piano in. Let's go back to where the electric piano actually enters. Now you can hear the electric piano actually has the melody here. So I'm going to want to be very conscious of that and bringing that forward to the point where I may even isolate that top voice and make it its own channel so I can bring it up independently. Now I want to balance out the harp a little bit, and I'm actually going to pan this about 10% to the right. Again, give it a little bit more isolation and provide some balance against that harp that's panned left. Now, as you can see, this is where the magic production actually becomes glaringly obvious. This is not the order that you just saw me put them in. I forgot my guitar tracks were down here. I actually prepped this beforehand, so I wouldn't have to go through the tedious process of separating all those tracks on camera and waste a bunch of time doing that. So let me bring my guitar tracks up here so we can put those back in where they should be. Now, I've got my guitar tracks, again, in the order that they were recorded, which is more or less what they're doing functionally. These are just some long chords. You'll also notice they have 2 guitar tracks for every guitar part. That's because with electric guitar, generally to make it sound full, especially if you're doing something with single notes, you want to be able to track it twice and pan them hard right and left. Now, you'll notice that my pans are not hard right and left here, down here. And that's just because there's actually something, part of my guitar signal chain in Guitar Rig is doing the panning for me, so that's all taking place internally. But anyway, let's start to add some of these guitar tracks in. Okay, so that's super hot compared to these are just supporting chords, so they don't need to be way out front like that. They're good chords, but not necessary to have them out front. But you can hear, because of the reverb and because of the delay, they actually already have some stereo character to them. But don't let that scare you off of panning them right or left if you need them to be on a specific side. For instance, in this case, we've got the same chords being played by the electric piano and the guitar, which creates a lot of muddiness between those two. So I'm going to use the panning to make those clearer. And I may actually balance those out against each other, where initially I went from with the electric piano and the harp balancing each other. Now, because I'm hearing that crosstalk, I'm going to instead balance the guitar with the electric piano. I'm going to pan the electric piano further to the right, about 30%, and I'm going to take my guitar 1 and pan it about the same amount to the left. You don't have to be exact with your panning. In fact, sometimes it's better not to be, because you don't want stuff to sound clinical and exactly lined up. You want it to have a pretty good natural spread. And now I can hear those guitar and keys parts about in equal measure in my headphones. So I'm going to move on to the next guitar part and bring that in. Again, the guitars are just going to be hotter because they were recorded live. I'm not running off of a plugin. This part's barely adding anything in terms of substance. It's just a little texture. So A, I don't need it loud, and B, I don't need it dead center. The only stuff that you should have dead center is stuff that you want everybody paying attention to, and that you want it to feel present. I don't need this to feel present, so I'm just going to kick this way off to the side. And again, right or left, I'm kind of choosing at random. Okay, now that's a little bit too far. It's kind of standing out in how far right it is, so I'm actually going to bring it back just a little bit. And I can just about hear everything there. It's still present, I'm still conscious of that harp. That's going to be the big thing that I want to keep coming through in this entire piece. Cool, going to go ahead and add in guitar 3. And this is where the melody starts to come forward. So this is going to be a more important guitar part. Now, because this is a melodic element, I'm not really going to mess too much with the panning. I'm going to leave it pretty much dead center, maybe 5% left or right, just to give it a little bit of that stereo feel. But it's a melodic element. I want it dead center, which means it's also competing for sonic real estate with the bass, the drum, with the kick drum, and the snare. And that's a very important thing to keep in mind as we move forward, because it's very easy to lose those elements that are in the same space in terms of panning. starting to lose that harp a little bit, so I may actually bring everything that's not harp down just a little bit in comparison. And I'm not bringing the harp up to make it more audible because, again, I'm looking over here at my master channel and I'm seeing those peaks get a little bit closer to the very top of the meter, which will create clipping, and that's obviously something that we very much do not want. So I'm going to come over here, oops, and let me just go ahead and make sure. Now, it's important to remember when you are messing with buses, you want to mix, once the bus is mixed internally, you have the components that are in the bus mixed, you want to leave those alone and control it overall. So let's just bring all this stuff down, and of course I deselected that. Let's actually just bring those down. Just a few decibels, I'm not going for anything extreme here. You'll also notice that I'm listening in longer and longer intervals as we move through the mix. It's because I want to hear about basically every section that an instrument is in as I decide its place in the mix. So I'm pretty happy with that lead guitar. Let's move on to guitar 4, which I'll be totally honest, I don't remember what it is. And in fact, if you look closely, you can see I even did not record this one in stereo, which means that I probably just added it to be a little bit of support for something else. Let's solo that just to figure out what it is. Yeah, it's just a single note melody to support the tremolo. So I definitely don't want that way out front. Next guitar, I think this is kind of a similar idea. Let's again just solo it just to make sure I know what I'm doing. Yeah, just root notes. And one thing that you'll notice about when I took all those instruments down in relation to the harp, how quickly my peak values dropped. I only moved each channel about 2 to 4 decibels, but suddenly I've got 5 more decibels of headroom on my master channel. It's a lot of channels. The small volume changes add up very quickly in both directions. So don't make big changes once you've got your master bus kind of sitting at a nice level. Everything should be tiny little changes because it doesn't take much to get the overall level to change. So we're on our last guitar track here, track 5, which is just a bunch of big chords, which are definitely going to need to come down. So let's actually just start from a place of doing that. And remarkably, through all of that, I can actually still hear the harp, even with those big, full guitar chords down there. So now let's start adding in some of the stuff that's closer to the beginning, the more classical instruments, and that's really going to change the character of how we're mixing here. So we've got our celesta, which is our lead instrument. It's not really doesn't have much to compete against with the other instruments except the harp right now. So let's just listen to how those two sit together. All right, so the celesta is clearly a melodic instrument here, against the very textural, kind of pad-sounding harp. I want that to stand out a little bit more, so I'm just going to bring that up. But again, I'm going to leave it dead center because it is very much a lead instrument. Yeah, and even that little change just made a huge difference. So let's go ahead and add. So the reverse celesta is just kind of a nice, again, a little textural element. I'm going to bring that down preemptively. And the goal here is I want the end of my celeste to swell. Basically what I did is I took the first note here and I just rendered it as an audio sample and reversed it, so you get this nice lead into it. I think I also actually sped it up. But I want the end of that swell to be just as loud as the start of this note, or maybe even a little bit softer so the attack on the celesta really comes through. That's nice. I actually kind of like that it took a little bit of the attack off of the celesta that's playing the melody, the forward playing celesta. It's just kind of a nice element, so I'm actually pretty happy with how that is fit together. Nice. Okay. All right, my strings bus is here, and so we're just going to go through. And I'm actually going to do all of these at the same time. And what I'm going to do with panning them is I'm basically just going to pan them as though I was sitting in front of an orchestra. So strings are dead center because that's a stereo patch. My violin sustain is going to go about 60% to the left, maybe 70%. We'll see how it sounds. Viola sustain, we're going to put it about 30% left. Cello is going to go about 30% right. And those double basses are going to crank way over to about 65%. I don't want to put them quite as far as the violins because they are a little central there at the beginning. And let's see how that sounds in the context. And you see the strings happen here at the beginning and at the end. So we'll talk about that, how that affects the mix in just a second. All right, it's a little bit wimpy. So I'm going to go ahead and bring my sustain strings bus up to 0. All right, I'm going to go ahead and solo my bus here just because I'm a little bit worried that my mix is not going to be quite as lush sounding as I would like it to be. All right, I can hear each of those parts pretty well individually. I'm just going to jump here where the violins have the melody, make sure they really are singing out over everything else. Not so much. So the mix sounds really good over here in terms of having those violins singing out over everything else. So this is where automation comes in. I'm going to go ahead and actually put in my volume automation. This is normally something I save more towards the end of the mix in terms of fine-tuning everything, but it's good to put general automation in just so you can really make sure that every single part of your mix is going to be sounding good. So let's see what that does for me. I'm actually going to go ahead and bring the viola down because it's doubling the melody a little much there. My computer's freaking out. That's fine. Everything's fine. Cool. So we are sounding good on those. All right, and now we just have a couple more instruments to add in. Oh, we got to make sure our string bus is good in relation to everything else. It's a little loud. Did there very quickly. I just want to make sure that I liked the violins coming up high in the full mix. I just deleted that automation point and then put it back in because I didn't like what I heard when I took it out. I am going to reduce it a little bit because it's a little far forward for me. Very much splitting the difference here, being really cautious about it. All right, so I'm going to end up bringing the string bus down at the end there. Because if you listen to the beginning, you can hear that celesta is really singing out in front of everything. And I kind of want the string melody to be roughly equal to that. So what I'm going to do, instead of what I did before, is I'm going to bring the string bus up a little bit, and I'm actually going to automate that to come down just a skosh. As we get, oops, not there. Here. Pop that in there. Bring it down just a little bit. Because I do want that guitar to be the lead voice. I don't really want my violins to be the lead voice there. And with that, I think the only thing we need to add in is our staccato strings, which come in here at the end. I didn't separate those into their component voices just because I don't really need that much control over the staccato strings, as there's only really one voice. It's one line going up and down. It's not a multi-voice instrument, so I'm pretty comfortable with it being just the single channel handling all of those different instruments. So you probably saw me messing around with the pan there on those solo strings. I was really just kind of feeling, where is there a little bit of space in the mix where I don't have anything? occupying that space, because this is just a nice little textural thing. It doesn't need to be way out front. It just adds a lot of rhythm and motivation, rhythm and momentum to the piece. And then we're just going to add the Apocalypse piano here at the beginning. Good. It's very understated and ominous, which is exactly what I wanted. So this is actually a pretty good rough mix we have assembled here. Now I just want to make sure I've got a decent volume that I can work as we go forward. I can really hear everything very clearly. So once again, I'm going to go through and select all my channels, except for the stuff within the bus, because I don't want to mess with that, because that will totally mess up the mix if I move those in addition to the buses. And we're just going to go to the middle here and get it to a point where I'm not clipping, but it's good and loud. Cool. All right, so let's listen through the whole thing and see how a rough mix sounds. Thing to remember about mixing is it's never too late to change something in mix unless you've printed it, and even then go back and do it again and reprint it. So actually I'm feeling like that celeste is a little bit loud compared to everything else. I'm going to just run up here, run down here, and I'll just grab these two. I feel like they're in a good place in relation to one another, but it's really kind of screaming over everything else, and it doesn't sit in a good place next to the strings. Also often make decisions on the fly as I'm listening to them, just so I can A/B them really easily and compare them to one another. Alright, so I made just a little couple adjustments there. It's definitely not a perfect mix, but it's a whole lot clearer than when we started. There is a sense of space left to right as well as front to back. That's that breadth and depth I was talking about before. As well as clarity, so I can hear every track at any point in the song, no matter where I am. Obviously, the leads could stand to come out a little bit more. The supportive stuff gets a little bit muddy, the big chords, but that's something that we'll all get to in parts 2 and 3, finding ways to make those really sing out a little bit more. So that's a rough mix assembled. Let's go ahead and listen to it one more time, just to make sure everything's where we want it to be. Alright, so there's our rough mix. It's definitely not perfect, but it is a whole lot further along than when we started, especially with those big 3 qualities we were talking about: breadth, depth, and clarity. If you want to see more videos and tutorials like this one, subscribe to this channel. I'm actually going to be following this video up next month with another tutorial, taking this mix and applying dynamic processing to it. So using plugins, namely compression, equalization, and reverb to further enhance the mix. There'll also be a lot of great tutorials coming out and great content coming out later this year from other members of the Music Weeklies community. You can also follow Music Weeklies on Twitter @MusicWeeklies to see all the incredible things that they are doing, namely their weekly composition challenges, where a whole bunch of composers come together and write music based on a given theme each week. You can also follow me on social media @KeithAm here on both Instagram and Twitter, or you can check out my website, www.keithlewismusic.com. Thank you so much for watching, guys, and I will see you in the next one.